welcome Associate Professor of Criminology John MacDonald from the University of Pennsylvania. John has had an exceptionally productive career, starting at the RAND Corporation. And I became aware of his research, and John, I never quite admitted this to you, but late in the revise and resubmit stage of a paper where I was looking at the impacts of transportation on physical activity and health. I did one of these final checks of, is there anything else out there in the literature? And John, with co-authors, had a very nice paper based on what was a very interesting evaluation of new light rail transit in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so my first reaction is, oh my gosh, someone else is doing this. And then I thought, well, of course, what I should do is put in a citation to this. And it was very nice work. And I was always quite impressed. After the paper was published, I got this email from this fellow, John MacDonald, saying, I saw your paper, and I rather liked it. And so this began some discussion back and forth about topics of place, physical activity, health. John's bailiwick, more than anything, is criminology. And he's looked at criminology and crime prevention from a lot of angles. He's an award-winning scholar. He has won the Young Experimental Scholar Award from the Academy of Experimental Criminology and the David Kershaw Award for Distinguished Contribution to Public Policy Analysis from the Association of Public Policy Analysis and Management. Both of those are pretty big things, to paraphrase but not exactly quote our Vice President. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce John MacDonald.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I don't know what the norms are in the Price School, but feel free to interrupt me or ask questions. I'm probably better in some ways than giving a talk when people ask questions than not. But today, this is really, I'm very excited about this opportunity because I'm trying to get out and talk about this research beyond criminology. And in particular, I'm interested in feedback from faculty in different disciplines like planning and design, as well as real estate, since some of this work is influenced by that. This is part of an effort to kind of put together some work I've been doing over the years. And hopefully by the end of the summer, I'll actually have a book out that's going to flow out of this work, which is really an effort to think about the role of place and how that influences how we can modify places in a meaningful way to reduce crime and improve public health outcomes. So a couple facts, just some stylized facts about human activities and how they affect crime and health. So one thing that anybody who looks at a crime density map in a city like Los Angeles would know is that crimes are geographically clustered, right? And most violent crimes tend to take place outside of the home. The exception to that would be domestic violence. So 70% of robberies, if we look at victimization data, happen in public places, 50% of assaults. And majority of these crimes are committed by strangers, so suggesting that there is an important role of place. Time matters. Evening and morning hours tend to be the peak times where we see these crimes occur. And this connects to more than just crime, because if you think about it, this is also the time when most people are engaged in their daily routines, like commuting to work or even going out on their leisure activities and maybe seeking exercise. Like this morning, this is a slight tangent, I went for a jog around campus, and then I tried to go south, and then I started thinking about how the trees weren't cut back very much in the park across the street, and I didn't want to be my own data point before the talk, so I decided to come back onto campus. So let's just give you a sidebar here. We also know that poor health and high crime are concentrated geographically, right? So these are both human activities. They happen outside, and they're geographically concentrated. So there's consistent features: poor health, high crime, concentrated poverty, residential instability or stability in the sense of, to quote sociologists like William Julius Wilson, people call this poverty traps, right? So this idea that place matters is fundamental. And also the business disinvestment happens in these places. And these places then develop features. Some people refer to this as features of the built environment. So these can be economic features like reduction in property values or the lack of appreciation of property, or they can be social features like whether or not residents are willing to intervene when they see problems or engage in some form of informal social control, or what Rob Sampson and Felton Earls call collective efficacy. So this is all kind of frame why place matters. Here's the problem. We know that there's features of the built environment that appear to reduce physical activity, or at least correlate with reduced physical activity, and are correlated with increased crime. But we don't have really strong causal connections for a variety of reasons. So what I'm going to try to do with several of these case studies is present case studies that give you a little bit of more of a causal story, I think, a causal connection. Most research, we don't know the direct link because it's cross-sectional, and there's a failure to take into account selection bias. So I'm not going to get into that because this isn't an econometric talk. But you do know that obviously we all make decisions about where we're going to live, or we're constrained in terms of the decisions about where we can live. On the other hand, people make choices like I might be interested in walking, so I might want to buy a house close to rail to commute. And so there's daily established habits that influence where people go. But we also do know from some research, including experimental research from moving to opportunities experiments, that selection isn't all of it. Even if you take into account selection, MTO, they actually randomized people out of public housing, and they found marginal changes, at least in exposure to violence. The main outcome that seems to be the most convincing outcome is a reduction in diabetes and the likelihood of obesity, and then improvements in social well-being, which is really just a measure, by the way, of happiness. And it's probably not a shocker to think that if you move out of public housing, you might be marginally happier than if you stayed in public housing. But I'm going to talk a little bit about a theory of markets. Part of it is trying to think this about place, the role of place, why it's important, and how we structure places. So Phil Cook in the 70s wrote a paper on this, thinking about crime markets, basically trying to take economic theory and apply it to place. So some of the same ideas that come out of planning on why place matters, it's just providing an economic model, essentially. He refers to this as an opportunity theory. So this is basically an idea that you can, by modifying places or place environments, you can shift the supply curve. You can make opportunities for crime less attractive, and you can make opportunities for physical activity more attractive. And it's just a way of thinking about, we focus so much effort typically in public policy on demand side things, and how just by shifting the supply of opportunities, you can change these outcomes. Now, this is not something that Phil came up with. It's just an economic model, basically, for explaining the process. So we make areas less attractive to crime, more attractive to physical activity. Marcus Felsen and Larry Cohen in the 70s wrote about this in Criminology in terms of the routine activities theory. And there's just an interesting quote when they note that the spatio-social temporal organization of social activities help people translate their criminal inclinations into action. So basically this idea, people might have propensities to commit crime, but it's only in the right context in which they're willing to do it. Okay, so this is to give you framing. Now I'll actually try to get into some of these case studies, which is basically how can we make places less attractive for crime and more attractive for active lifestyles. I'm going to give you 2 case studies of Los Angeles, including work, both these case studies I did with Ricky Blumenthal here, and then 2 case studies from Philadelphia that are looking at different aspects of the built environment. Both of these are evidence of place-based approaches that come out of thinking about community economic development models or land use and land maintenance. So how we do zoning and how we maintain properties. So to frame community economic development models, you can just think of this as a place-based approach. And this is very once over lightly. I'm not doing justice to the whole approach to community economic development, but just saying that this is an approach where geographically focused approach where people can step in, sometimes in the place or in conjunction with government entities, and try to develop things like employment, housing, business opportunities, try to enhance the amenities of that environment. And some of these can also serve as frameworks for reducing crime. And this at least was the theory that we framed proposal to the Centers for Disease Control to get funding. So there was a theory behind this. And that theory was focusing on community economic development models of BIDs and the role of business improvement districts as a self-organizing local public-private partnership where focused geographically, where there's an assessment the businesses pay. Come on in. There's an assessment the businesses pay, and these get recycled back into trying to provide some kind of amenities. Typically, that focuses on public safety or place promotion or beautification. And obviously, we're in the middle of, well, I'll jump ahead. Talk about our approach here for one case study of BIDs in LA. There's a series of papers that came out of this one. I'm just going to highlight one that's very explicit to crime, and it's easy to conceptualize. Between 1995 and 2003, LA, there were 30 BIDs formed. There's been a few that have been added in recent years. A number of these BIDs spend quite a bit of money on public safety or private security. 11, about a third of them spending more than $200,000 a year. Some spend as much as $1 million. I'm going to skip over, just mention there's a collection of BIDs in different areas. Some of you may be familiar with Central City East or downtown San Pedro. And then there's BIDs up in the valley, which are obviously of a different form. Public safety is not a big concern in these kind of small, sleepy areas. It's just more place promotion. So I'm going to focus primarily in this case study on the BIDs that really are focused on public safety and changing the place environment. Okay, so I wanted to point out, given that I'm at USC, that USC is part of a BID. For those of you who don't know this, I would imagine almost everybody does, because last night as I was walking to CVS, I noticed my community ambassador with the blue shirt on, and the person said hi to me, and I thought, there's BID in action. Okay, so safety ambassadors here in Figueroa, and USC obviously is the biggest contributor to the BID in terms of, I'm sure in terms of the budget. Spend about $500,000 a year. And this is $2,005, about half of its operating budget. They also spend about a third on clean teams. So these are teams that go out and pick up trash and remove graffiti. If you look at the Figueroa publications, this is a substantial amount of trash cleanup and graffiti removal. So there's a big effort here around USC on public safety and cleanliness is in addition to place promotion. All right, so the case study I'm going to show you real quick is a publication that Phil Cook and I did, taking, so this is derivative product, but looking at the role of public safety in BIDs and specifically focusing on the input of basically spending on public safety. And this appeared in the Economic Journal. And it's pretty simple. What we did is we basically studied, looked at BIDs, and we compared what happened to BIDs, crime rates before and after they're formed. And we compared that both on crime and arrest, because there is some discussion that, well, maybe you reduce crime by just arresting lots more people, that this is just increasing formal social control. So we wanted to look at both outcomes. And then the economic angle to this is really focusing on the spending side. So what do you get for the dose of private security spending? What do you get in terms of a response on these outcomes? So the upshot is we basically compared these neighborhoods in Los Angeles to other neighborhoods in Los Angeles didn't get BIDs. So this is not an experiment. It's basically it's a quasi-experimental design. So it's basically just comparing before and after changes in these BID areas compared to before and after changes in non-BID areas. We try to do some efforts to make the comparison better by comparing comparing other areas in the same sections of Los Angeles using police division data. That's just kind of 2018 to 2019 sections of Los Angeles. And the upshot is we find about a 15% reduction in serious crimes. We also find a reduction in arrests, bigger reduction in actual arrests, 40%. And if you calculate the amount of money spent, it's about a $5 million savings to the city in arrests. And this is just using kind of a back of the envelope calculation taken from a RAND report where the police report on kind of what's it cost in case processing time, prosecution time. So this is just giving you kind of a ballpark that, not only do you reduce crime, but you reduce arrests, and there is some direct savings. And I think what's important is we found that these reductions aren't just temporary. So many efforts, people focus on place, they just say, oh, this is just simply a temporary reduction and things will go back. People will readjust, they'll get used to the safety ambassadors, they'll come back and they'll start mugging people again and so forth. So we don't see that. What we see is a pretty sustained change. That graph, I think, shows you it's all under 0 and pretty consistent. Now, the one feature that we added here that I thought was interesting, not just because it's my own paper, by the way, but because they were trying to think of, what can we do that's innovative here? And was, it's not simple. Not every bid's the same. So focusing on those bids that actually spend a substantial amount of money on private security. So we focus on the bids that are spending at least a quarter of their budget. And so, on a scale where you can actually hire enough people to be out and about. And if you look at that, we did a model with that in it. And if you look at it, it looks like for about $10,000 investment in the neighborhood on private security, you get about 3 fewer crimes, a little over 3 fewer crimes in that neighborhood over time, per year, essentially. And almost 2 fewer arrests. So that's substantial, yeah.
I'm trying to understand the math. Could you go back to?
Sure.
So at the bottom, it suggests that what's being actually done is not savings of money, but actually the transference of the spending from the public to the private, right? And it actually increased the cost of that saving because you went from 5 to 10. So can you? Oh, no,
okay, yeah, you're right. So there's a $5 million saving to the city, and this is essentially roughly the cost of $10 million in private spending. You're right. So if you're thinking of that as a literal transfer, but you can imagine that bids, their operations aren't really about trying to save the city direct money in terms of criminal justice process.
No, I understand that. Yeah. I worry because public policy is we don't need as much money for the police. Because what we have to do is have Marlin spend more money of his own, right? Or USC spend more money of its own. No. And so transferring the burden to the private individual or to the private enterprise.
No, and that's right. And that's this is well, first of all, I want to say these are marginal changes, right? Not absolute. And one of the things you could point out, I should have pointed this out, is there's a huge secular decline in crime in Los Angeles, as you're aware. So this is just like an additional decline. It would be very foolish to think that you could literally just privatize these spaces and that you could offset, you could cut back police budgets and that, things would go away. But you're right. There is that threat that people think that that's literally, a direct implication. And the safety ambassadors, right, are just extra eyes and ears mostly. They're definitely not going to be a replacement for an organized police force. Although you could imagine, right, that USC could, you could privatize police forces and so forth, but then, yeah. You've done that too. Yeah, right. Yes, Joanne.
I'm wondering if you see increases or if you see spillovers. So.
Great question. That's on the next slide. So, or the next slide. So one thing I was going to say, and I'll get to that next, is if you look at crimes as social costs, so not direct costs to the city, but just if you take costs of crime calculations from kind of public sources. So these are based on willingness to pay or contingent valuation methods or hedonic pricing. You get a range of estimates, but usually robberies are somewhere in the order of $200,000 to $300,000 range for the social cost of a robbery. So if you take kind of social cost estimates and you figure for the marginal reduction in robbery, there's a substantial social payoff. So $10,000 expenditure of private security in a bid is associated with basically $155 social savings, but like that's not actual savings to a budget. It's just if you calculate the social value of these things. And you see that it scales down obviously with the less serious crimes. So going back to your point, is this just displacing or spilling? You could have spillover, which in some ways might be beneficial if it's spillover in terms of decline, or you could have displacement, right, which might, another way, which is crime going up, right? I think about my 6-year-old and, the game whack-a-mole, right, where you try to whack down the mole and then it pops up over here. So, that's often a concern. Well, maybe that you're just pushing it out. And so we actually tested for this. Essentially, took the neighborhoods adjacent, the neighboring reporting districts in Los Angeles, adjacent to the bid reporting districts, and do the same estimate, but pull the bid ones out. So essentially the same timing. So those neighbors become kind of turned on when the bid starts. And then you compare the two estimates to each other. And all you have to note here is that if there was displacement, what you would see is that top line where it says bid neighbors, you would see a significant increase in crime. What you see is basically no difference. It's all null, except for auto theft. It looks like it's maybe spilling over a little bit of a reduction in arrests for auto theft. And you have this consistent reduction in bid areas. And the comparison is just a comparison of those two estimates, and all favors bids. So bids are dropping crime, and there isn't spillover in the sense that there isn't like these great external benefits beyond them, but there doesn't look like there's displacement either. So, that's a marginally good story. That's a good story for bids. It's a good story in the sense of if you think about how these are organized in Los Angeles, only the people receiving the benefit are supposed to pay. So in some ways, this is the model that you want. Now, maybe a greater public welfare value you'd want no spillover, right? But then technically, then those spillover areas would have to start paying for bids, which is kind of an odd thing to think about. But okay, so what about Figueroa? So here's a graph of Figueroa, including just stylizes. There's no estimate here. But what you can see, first of all, is crime is dropping radically in Los Angeles in the 90s, like it is across the country, right? So Figueroa started in 1998. It had the benefit of the secular decline. You see the secular decline outside of Figueroa. So these are all the areas around Figueroa, around USC. And the point is, there's a little bit of a bump in total crime. So this is the total added up. And then it comes back down, and you see the same kind of shape here. But this is not a statistical test. It's just kind of to show you that you don't see like this rise outside of Figueroa, on the other side of 110.
So the line is the bid?
So the line here is just where when the bid started, and what you see here for Figueroa is just the raw count of the number of crimes in all those neighborhoods, and then you see the same thing outside of Figueroa. So these are just all the neighborhoods that are boundaried around Figueroa. So this is across the 110, across just is it MacArthur Park? I guess I'm trying to remember my LA geography, but kind of the boundary around Adams, West, is it West Adams, Normandy, and West Adams, so kind of the boundary area.
So
John?
yeah.
So there's a counterintuitive effect after in the Figueroa there, crime actually went up?
So, what's interesting, right, if you just look at the raw unadjusted, right, is, there looks like there's a bump at some period in the 2000s, right? If you drew a linear trend, obviously it's going way down, and then it's if you drew a linear trend through that, by 2005 it's back down again. But there's definitely some bump in the early 2000s. The only thing I can say is this is true for most of the city between 2000 and 2002. Los Angeles's crime actually was going down, it started going up again. Some of you may remember Rampart scandal, and it seems like, and then Bratton came in, and then the miracle was solved. I'm joking, but then crime rates started dropping around 2002 again. But if you took a longer historical view, you'd see that crime rates in Los Angeles have basically were trending downward, except for that bump going back to the early 90s. And so now we're at a crime rate that we haven't seen since the early 60s.
Before the bump, when your secular
Yeah.
rate going down, but in the dotted line, it begins to go up as soon as the bids was.
Well, this is a couple of years out, so this is about 4 years out. So something starts to happen. I don't know what it is here. I mean, the moral of the story on these 30 comparisons is, on average, you see that there's a benefit of bids. So, this could be driven also by a couple neighborhoods, a couple pockets. I don't have a clear explanation on this one trend line. This is downside to trends, right? Models are easier to explain. So one of the things I wanted to say is bids do fit within this place-based approach of trying to focus on improving economic development and reducing criminal opportunities. And it's suggestive evidence that bids, when they're focused on place-based approaches, public safety, can provide one method of at least reducing criminal opportunities in that target area. And obviously, there's more than just the Figueroa corridor. I was thinking as I was walking through campus here how Oscar Newman would be happy based on the clear crime prevention through environmental design. I'm going to give you another quick case study of.
Yeah, just a question before you go on. You mentioned something about enhancing economic development. Do you have any information on the within and outside bid areas in terms of the, what do we call it, gross receipts in retail or anything else about business?
I have not done that, and I thought that would be actually, I mean, I've seen some very weak case studies of that, but I think that would be an interesting to look at, exactly what are the business receipts, what are returns on taxes, business taxes.
Avoided costs, I think, is what you showed us.
Yeah.
Not real increases, but avoided costs.
Right, so you could imagine if you could get really location data on that in Los Angeles, for example, even going back and just saying, like, did you see this bump? Saying that you see it around USC is going to be very specific too, obviously, because there's a lot of things happening. But if you see it around a bunch of different bids, that would be positive. That would be some evidence of that, right? So I'm going to give you a very similar case, but slightly different of my hometown now, Philadelphia. And this is the University City District, which is a bid which Penn is involved in, right? So this is like another variant of USC. And Penn also, in addition to being involved in this bid, Penn, the University of Pennsylvania, funds the largest privately funded police department, publicly chartered police department in the country. It's the third largest university police, in Pennsylvania. It's the third largest university police department in the country. I'm not sure where USC ranks. It's somewhere up there, I think, right? But I'm not positive. It's about 100 police officers. So what we have here in this map is the University City District Business Improvement District, and then Penn's border, that's in red. And what you see outside of that is what Penn did is years ago they decided to kind of expand their boundary, focus on improving economic development or in the adjacent neighborhoods to the campus by also reducing crime, right? So trying to get businesses back in the adjacent neighborhoods, and that's at this point pretty much a success in terms of the storefronts, redevelopments, and all that. But we try to answer this question of what role does this extra police boundary have on crime? There's one thing to say the stores look better, things have changed, but do we actually see a crime control benefit? And so what we decided to do, John Click and I, is basically use what's called a regression discontinuity design. So the idea here is as you get closer to this boundary, then the blocks look more similar, but for the difference in police. And I can show you some pictures of that. The police basically just decided this was as far out as they wanted to go. They didn't want to go all the way, take the whole neighborhood over. And so here's an example, 43rd in Baltimore. So this is where the boundary is, and you can see a picture of, essentially there's not a wall there. It's not like the Berlin Wall or something. 43rd and Locust. So these are different boundaries. And at that boundary, things are very similar. In some ways, sometimes they actually favor crime on the Penn side because there are some more businesses closer into Penn's campus. But we're trying to focus on that boundary effect. You don't have to worry what a nonlinear polynomial model is, but all we're doing is basically taking into account, you can look at alpha there, is the estimate of what happens when you switch to the one side of the boundary to the other. And all those other terms are just trying to take into account that it's not going to be linear. You're not going to have this simple linear change. That's going to probably be different blocks that kind of have peaks and valleys. And so this just gives us an estimate of the effect of the police boundary. Going back to that graph real quick, just think if there's a drop-off, essentially. That's the estimate we're going for. This is used in education research often where you have like a scoring mechanism that maybe puts people in one class size versus the other.
How wide are your boundaries?
They're right there at the street. So it's literally, they stay on one side of the street. Now, of course, sometimes they'll, if somebody commits a crime and runs across the street, they'll catch them. But if it's on that side of the street, they're effectively just focused on kind of the internal boundary. And they do patrol. They have kind of a 6 to 8 officer force that moves around the boundary too. So what is the effect we observe when we estimate? We see for violent crimes about a 60% relative drop at that boundary. So it's 8.7 fewer crimes. It's a 60% change. We see 55% for property. Street crimes, which are just crimes like breaking into cars, robbery, purse snatching. What was the other category? I'm blanking on it right now. We see a 46%, so we try to focus on those things that police are likely to be able to detect. Oh, and simple assaults. And if we look at overall crime, you see basically a consistent trend across all these crimes types. Now, the graph I'm going to show you might be even more convincing, or not. Here's the boundary effect. Like I mentioned, it's a nonlinear model. So what you see is what you see is a drop-off there, and obviously it's not linearly changing away at the distance, but essentially there's basically an intercept shift. These two things change, and the only thing we can say is there's something fundamentally different about that boundary that the police are using. When I take that same estimate and I scramble the distance, so in other words, it's this bottom axis here, the x-axis, I just randomize it. What you'll see is that basically that boundary effect disappears. So here's it when I basically, that's the actual boundary distance. This is a shuffled boundary distance. And you can see that essentially the two trends now connect to each other. Okay, so
John,
yeah.
What year are those data from?
So these data are from 5 years of data, 2005 to 6 years of data, 2005 to 2010.
Okay, and I like the shuffle boundary. Go back to the previous slide. I have a question.
Sure.
When did Penn establish this outer boundary police force?
Yeah, so unfortunately we don't have a pre-period. That was what I would have liked.
Cool to do that.
Yeah, it would have been great, but unfortunately the data aren't reliable back to the kind of original period. So Penn started the boundary when Judy Rodin was president, and there was graduate student, for example, was murdered off campus. The interesting thing is the boundary wouldn't have helped that case. But it was part of, that was kind of the last straw that led to this, like, okay, we need to do something, and we can't just rely on the Philadelphia's finest. So no, you're right, that would have made it much better. The only thing I can say is when we do the estimate, we take into account year trends, so if we break it up by year, we get the same thing, but we don't have a before after. We also see a consistent pattern for most crimes. The one thing I'd point out, there's one exception to that. All the small, really rare crimes, you don't see much of an effect because there just aren't that many. So if you think about it, you have very few cases on any block. Yeah.
We tried, I mean, Penn Design, for instance, has put a lot of time and energy and money into the area around Penn. Mm-hmm. And have you tried to figure out where there might be an example of where they have done a big project and seen whether in places where they've done less around the boundaries, and see if there's variation based upon not just policing the whole area, but the other kinds of variables that might be affecting?
I haven't done that yet, but we're trying to think about a couple things like that, including some housing development effort, student housing development that was done around the boundary, and thinking about trying to get that location specific, kind of a very micro kind of place-based. So yeah, the School of Design's definitely been involved in part of the whole plan for the university district. And that would, I think, make it, give it another context. The one crime I was going to say that there's no boundary effect, if you see there, is theft from buildings, right? That's what the driver is back here. Those outliers inside the boundary are the hospitals, where people often go in and steal stuff. So that makes sense. The buildings have a lot nicer things to steal in the university campus than outside the university campus. So lock your offices. That's the moral of the story. So I'll skip over this and just say that there's a pretty large effect. We try a bunch of different models, and the implied elasticities, it turns out it's about 2 times the police force for about a 60% reduction. So that's an elasticity of about 0.3, negative 0.3. So for a 10% increase in policing, you get about a 3% reduction. And I don't know how this happens, but it's almost very similar to all the other police elasticity estimates. So that's either a coincidence or maybe we're actually finding something that is meaningful. And what's important here, I think, is this is a sustained effort. It's not just one of those quick crackdowns. All right, so let me talk. How much time do I have before I run out?
5 or 10.
Okay. All right, so let me skip over this and just say, we know that land use lot, the idea of using land use lot itself to shift the built environment is not a new idea. This is the Statute of Winchester mentions this, right? And the idea of changing roadways, changing places, zoning comes out of a lot of, the idea that zoning matters, not just for things like human activity, but crime is not a terribly new idea. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of focus, and there's been empirical research on this, but a lot of it case study driven. And so we've tried in this case study to try to add to that literature by adding in lots of different places. So new urbanism, active living communities, trends towards mixed-use development, all that kind of work that a number of you in this room are familiar with. So I'll skip over that and just say in this study, with just LA specific, we focused on the idea that land use zoning may be correlated with crime. And we try to add to that literature by picking a lot of different locations. And so this is what we did. We took, and if you're interested in this, there's a Penn Law Review article on this, and it goes, law reviews give you like the whole history, from 1200 to present. But here's the design. We basically took 8 different parts of Los Angeles, neighborhood areas, and then we somewhat randomly, blind to the outcome, we picked blocks that had different zoning, primary and secondary zoning. And then what we did is we compared crime around those blocks. We also had Ricky send out trained field observers to also measure stuff on these blocks. I'm not going to talk about that just because of time constraints, but I'm just going to show you what we found. We essentially fit then in each of these areas, we have a different block indicator, and then we have a parameter for each area because different areas have different average crime rates. So obviously Boyle Heights and Highland Park are going to have a different crime rate than West Adams. And we try to pick areas in the city where there's enough crime that you might be able to see something. If you're studying an outcome, you'd like to actually have the outcome vary. And this is what we found. We found essentially residential-only blocks have substantially lower expected crime at 100-meter distances around the block. We found so that might not be that shocking. But what we did find that I think is meaningful is we found that multiple-use blocks had substantially lower crime than blocks that were zoned for commercial-only uses. And so this is relative to other blocks in parts of Los Angeles. Now you can say, well, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening we can't observe, so we recognize that. So we try to add to this by looking at areas where the actual parcels changed. And for those of you who know Los Angeles land use law, it's very difficult to get parcels changed. So it doesn't require an act of God, but it's pretty difficult. So we collected data on zoning, each parcel from 2006, 8, and 10. And then we could basically compare those parcels that changed and then the crime rate in the neighborhoods that they were changing in. We did not have good enough crime location data to look at the distance from each individual parcel. We had to use neighborhood data. But the advantage of that is, I'll show you here, is we had a long pre-trend. We had 1994 to 2005 trends of crime in every neighborhood, and then we picked neighborhoods that were on identical trajectories of crime before the change, and then we compared those to the areas where there was actual parcel changes. So this is basically a difference in difference kind of design, finding kind of nearest neighbor crime, pre-crime trend comparisons. All right, and I won't tell you about the technique. It's just a propensity score approach. And the only thing worth pointing out is we get basically when we do this matching, we get areas that are very similar on their pre-crime trends. And the upshot is we find about a 6-7% reduction in the neighborhood crime. So for a base of around 100 crimes per neighborhood, you get 7 fewer where there's a zoning change. And it's mostly from auto theft and breaking into automobiles. Now the main zoning change in all of these are towards multiple use. I mean, we see it around this campus. In fact, I don't know if I'm allowed to reveal the neighborhoods. I guess I am. But these are places in central LA primarily where these zoning changes are occurring. There are some spots in West LA that fall out of our regression because changing from agricultural zoning to estate zoning is not an important change for crime trends. There's parts of LA that used to be agricultural, and now these mansions are determined estates. All right, so I think I'll just finish there and go to my concluding slide. Well, actually, let me do two things real quick because in time constraints. I'll just tell you this story real fast. So one of the other things is people say, well, that's changing zoning. What about doing something with actual land use zoning itself? And what we did in Philadelphia is we actually compared, quasi-experimentally, areas of vacant land that were greened. And I'll show you the picture, and then I'll show you the results. So there's a nonprofit that works, Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, that basically tries to clean up abandoned, overgrown property. And so you can see simple and noticeable results. It's not urban farming. They're just put in a picket fence and some grass. The cost of maintenance, they maintain the property. it's about the equivalent of paying to have your lawn mowed. It's a lot of areas of Philadelphia, unlike Los Angeles. If I go back, if I'll show you the density map, that's the amount of space that was greened in the city of Philadelphia, and the gray area are the control areas that weren't greened. It wasn't randomly assigned, but essentially these areas look very similar, and because there's such an overflow, they can't do all of them. And so what we did is compare the crime rates before and after in these two types of lots. And we also compared health measures from a health survey that's done. And what we found is gun assaults go down by about 7%. We found disorderly conduct arrests actually go up. Police arrest more people around these green spaces than the vacant ones. And we also found some changes in health. We found that stress appears to go down. You know, if you don't have an abandoned, overgrown property, seems like in your neighborhood, or it's been greened, I should say, more of them have been greened, stress appears to go down. And we also found, at least in one section of Philadelphia, exercise, regular exercise seems to go up. So let me wrap up by just saying, we know that there are spatial regularities in human activities, and it suggests place-based approaches might be an approach to thinking about how to influence crime and health outcomes. I think that this is one aspect, promising, thinking about the role of place as a supply, in some ways, side to complement demand-side types of interventions. My walkaway point would be thinking about how we can use a regulatory system to do more place-based approaches. You know, avoiding things like having arrest people, or even other demand-side interventions like, you know, encouraging people to exercise. All that's great, but if we can make places safer, maybe we'll get benefits on both outcomes.
So my tangent is this. So I've been over the last, thanks to USC, I teach undergraduates. And so that has made me become more reflective about my own research, right? So in the work that, like when John and I were at Rand, and, you know, even to a continuing extent, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on getting products out. And so you take sort of the available theories, and then you collect some data, and then you have findings, you know, and then you publish them, right? What it's made me think about is, we've discovered the scientific method, right? So the scientific method now is much better than it was 20 years ago, right? So we sort of have a general progressive movement in terms of getting better at understanding what observations matter and what observations don't. So how does that have anything to do with this? Well, one of the things that's always challenging, I think, about this kind of area of research, where you're sort of saying, you're asking yourself on one hand, hey, if I did something to a place independent of changing who's there, could I change the way the human activity happens in it? Mm-hmm. Versus, can I do something to the people, right, or something with the people, or add new people that are going to change the way those activities happen? And then maybe the $64,000 question, or $64 million question, or $1 trillion question is, you know, what's the role of government and politics in making any of that happen? And so, so how that relates, I guess, to this issue about the development of scientific method is, of course, you know, when it started, right, back in the 1600s and 1500s, when people were sort of crawling their way towards deciding that, hey, Aristotle said a lot of things that sort of made sense. We don't really need to observe it. You know, it seems like there's natural connections with these things, and they had all kinds of crazy ideas independent of observation. With the political system, the challenge is, you know, we have these sort of political routines that are difficult to break down, mm-hmm. and make people sort of decide, hey, maybe we should take an innovative or thoughtful approach to how the environment works. So the irony, I think, and you know, when I think about the bid stuff, I think, well, look, there you have a situation where you have people with resources who are willing to tax themselves, right? Not always effectively. So a lot of the bids don't do anything, really. That's the truth. But there's, mm-hmm. you know, 10 or 15% who are really good.
Yeah.
and they really mobilize themselves and other people around them, and they don't change the place, they change the human activity in the place. They introduce new humans who are, in blue shirts or pink vest or whatever the hell it is, that, is the flavor of the day, and they're wandering around, stopping stuff from happening, ironically,
Yeah.
right, by increasing sort of this control. Versus sort of you have the other ones where you have, there are plenty of vacant lots in South Central Los Angeles, right, that you could do the similar kinds of things, but then you've got to have the political will
To keep them up.
and the social organization to sustain it. And so I guess it just makes me wonder, so here's the first question, one of the things I've always appreciated about working with you is that you're so methodologically always leaning forward. I mean, you're always like, thinking about like, how can we get closer to having a stronger faith that this works? So the first question is, okay, this is fine and dandy. We're starting to get some longitudinal data. But from a scientific standpoint, like what really is the next step methodologically in terms of beginning to disentangle both what makes sense in terms of changing the human activity in space versus changing the spaces? And then also, how do you make the argument to the powers that be to do any of it, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's, as we all know, I mean, you guys are in planning school, so you interact with politicians all the time. I mean, one of the things that happens is if you can get organized, they'll let you do anything, right? I mean, there's no real, incentive for them to get in your way most of the time, right? It's in the situations where that isn't happening, mm-hmm. where, it's not the University of Penn or it isn't, our USC community, right? Where you have, I mean, let's be truthful, rich people, the children of rich people, upper middle class people, like, well, that's handled. I know how to keep my kids safe, right? And I do that with a combination of where I live and the kind of schools they go to and the places that I circulate in. But it's more in the places where there is sort of ongoing systemic poverty, these poverty tracks, and there isn't necessarily the political will to do anything. And it's sort of, that's where I think so what are the scientific methods that get us to that sort of question? So that's one thing. Then the other one is, and you've been looking at this stuff for a long time, particularly around crime, but also just in general, these sort of the light rail stuff and the physical activity stuff. And the other piece is the degree to which the environment matters at all. So the physical plant, right? So is it really changing the humans in the space? Does that make more sense? Or does it make more sense to change the physical sort of environment? All right, and so then let me see if I have anything last thing. Okay, and so then the last thing is, so this is the actual question that came out of this talk, because some of the stuff was new to me. And some of it is based on the conversation we had last night. So one of the things that John pointed out, and I mean, this gets at, and I'm probably not expressing this clearly enough, but because we are not, we're not independent observers, right? We all come to the urban environment and, with our own personal histories and our own insights and biases, really. I mean, and they're not bad, they just are what they are. One of the points you made about last night was car theft. And so what John shared with me was newer cars, one of the things that's happened is they're harder to steal. So what was it called? Ignition?
Immobilizer.
Ignition immobilizer. So I wonder, so you had this thing where the big effect was changes in Grand Theft Auto, and I guess I wonder the degree to which, so just on an empirical level, that kind of change really reflects more the technological advance in new cars and maybe the prevalence of new cars in an area.
When you have zoning change,
Right.
Maybe,
versus,
yeah.
you know what I mean,
Yeah,
the other things that are going on.
older cars parked in the abandoned lot.
Right.
Yeah, no, you're right. There's lots of confounding
Okay.
factors. So the first question
I'll sit down.
on the scientific method, the new direction, I don't know if it's a new direction, but I think one direction, we're doing this in Philadelphia on the vacant parcels, is we're actually doing a randomized controlled trial of parcels. Now you could say, yeah, but that's not, part of it was because that's what NIH wants to fund, but part of it was also thinking about, can we observe social changes among residents, and so we're surveying residents and physiological changes. And given that there's such an oversupply of these things, by doing a random assignment lottery, essentially, we get a sense of the purchase of this in multiple multiple contexts. And Philippe is involved in this, as well as having anthropologists sit out and look at certain drug corners and like, how does that change? So I think that's an important direction, but I agree to get better purchase on the context, because I think you're right. We can't, even getting a little bit better statistical estimates, or we're never, we're going to be missing a lot of that context in these kinds of, retrospective observational studies. I think in terms of the policy-making side of things, you're right. A lot of things happen almost by accident or not completely intention. And so my view is if we're going to be changing zoning anyway, or things like this in the cities, we should be just more thoughtful about the types of human activities that are affected, and not just the traffic flow. That's important. Or or the electric grid, or what the sewage system. How do you need to buy it? Do you need to expand? Do you need to expand certain aspects of the infrastructure, but thinking about the human activity side? And I think that doesn't get discussed aside from anecdote. So I think if that could be built into the policy making on the planning side, I think there's some promise on that. But it has to be kind of negotiated in a way. And then you could have advantages for areas, disadvantaged areas where they don't have the political capital to lobby for themselves as aggressively. If you had zoning that was more sensible around place and human activities, I think that would, could be a step in the right direction. And I think you just have to get people excited about it. There's a reason why you have the political capital to do this in Philadelphia, is because everyone recognizes that abandoned property is a problem. It's just an eyesore in the city of Philadelphia, pretty much everywhere except for in pockets. And so everyone wants to make the city look prettier. And I think that's different from maybe LA context, where you have pockets that are isolated socially and politically. So the upside to being a Rust Belt city is there's only upside, and the low cost, and the fact that part of this is foundation funded too. But it's definitely not a panacea. I mean, we're talking about 7% changes and things like that. It's this isn't getting rid of gun violence. This is just meaning there's 2 less shootings on a block, which is still important. But it's this isn't a cure for problems of concentrated poverty, intergenerational violence, and things like that. But it means if you're going to be doing this anyway, let's be sensible about it and try to make places safer.
So can you talk a little bit about how those messages are translated? And by that I mean, you're talking about how the community has changed. What's the strategy for letting people know about these kind of concrete changes that are taking place? Because that may kind of get an additional buzz.
Yeah, I agree, because I don't think it's all about, I think you can, some aspect of people change, but a lot of it's just changing the social environment, right? And then maybe at some level more people will change, but it's complicated. Part of it, I mean, we're not doing this, I'm not a great example of this, because, mostly efforts focused on, producing research, but there has to be translational aspect of this. Not just media coverage either, because media will cover things that are sensationally, like the light rail project I did. I've never gotten so much media coverage because it was about weight loss, or relative, so everybody's excited about that, women's magazines and so forth were calling me, and I thought, what? But I guess it was good coverage, but it was a splash, there has to be, I think, a sustained effort in lots of these dimensions, so that when political decisions are made, there's a community behind it. You're right. So the vacant lands aspect of Philadelphia, there is now a big push. There's community groups now getting involved more and say, we want more of this in our area too. But with zoning, I mean, that's, redevelopment, obviously people that are already redeveloping land would be happy about this, already have plans for mixed use development, but getting community groups to think about changing existing zoning, I mean, that's definitely a challenge.
I mean, I think that, I mean, there's another challenge, I think, too, just in terms of, what do people know? I mean, like,
Yeah.
so there's some things that, like, we can all have unambiguous responses to. Like, nobody likes empty lots.
Yeah, yeah.
Particularly as they get overgrown, right?
Yeah.
There really isn't anybody who's in favor of that.
Yeah, except for maybe a drug dealer who wants to hide their
Right,
guns
but he's
somewhere.
not on the neighborhood council.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
You don't have that problem. But I mean, I think it relates to the other thing about, I mean, I almost think of the word as humility, because I think part of the challenge is that, and this explains what, like you have this light rail thing and everyone's hot for it because it seems like it's related, weight loss, and a lot of people, there's a market for weight loss.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that having a light rail actually does anything to people's weight gain or loss, at all, ever. Like, you can't necessarily transport it.
Right, people have to be willing to take advantage of this.
Right.
People have to want to take over, people want to have to be invested in places.
Right.
Otherwise, you're right, it's, knowing the work doesn't necessarily lead to changes. But I think it's part of it's our roles to, in science is to try to inform the discussion at least. And the one nice thing I think about place-based approaches is you can get a broader range of political support for that than you can sometimes for demand-side approaches that people say, well, that's really expensive. You're spending it on, disproportionately on this group, where it's just like, or these behaviors, people should just know that they're not supposed to do that. And you say, well, look, no, we're trying to change the amenities. Everybody benefits, and so I mean,
It's a pretty place.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think I think that, but you're right.
Let me jump in. Kind of stepping back from, well, I say this with some trepidation. Right? I shouldn't say stepping back from place. Let me say that anyways. One argument I've heard is that the single most important factor in kind of the rebirth of downtowns across the U.S. has been the secular drop in crime, which has occurred nationwide over the past, 20 years. So my first question would be, would you agree with that? Does that sound right? And if so, my second question would be, do we know why crime is dropping?
Yeah, I would say I don't know. Honest answer would be I don't know to either, right? Because there are a lot of factors leading likely for people to reinvest in downtowns. Crime is probably, I mean, plus there's some, it's kind of an endogenous system in the sense of, it feeds on itself, right? The unintended consequences of purposive action. So, at some point people say, oh yeah, crime rate's down, it's safer, but I'm not sure that was the main driver. But then it's part of a nice story. Do we know why crime dropped? No, I don't think. I mean, I think there are a lot of explanations, for it. But I also think even there's momentum in that system. Once things start changing, obviously the major drug epidemic, crack cocaine waned. There's demographic changes to cities. There's some policing changes. There's not much change, I think we can say, based on prison, because we started doing that a long time ago, unless you think there's like a 15-year lag on that effect. I mean, but I don't think there's a single kind of clear explanation. But definitely, there's a good news. I mean, what's the crime rate in Los Angeles now? It's like at the rate it was in like 1962 or 58 or something. I mean, it's really, it's not low everywhere, but it's noticeably low. And even in the highest crime neighborhoods, it's much lower than it was, 20 years ago. And so I think, it's positive.
Good time for probably one last question. Usually people are itching to get the last word.
Warn them out. Thank you very much. It was
all right. Let's give our speakers a hand.